Good day and welcome to the side event, UN Guiding Principles and National Action Plans, a remedy for victims and human rights defenders. I am your moderator for this evening. My name is Pochoy Labog from the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. This is a side event run by civil society, organized by the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, the Manushya Foundation, the International Service for Human Rights, and Project on Organizing, Development, Education, and Research, or PODER. In the first decade of the UNGPs, we witnessed the introduction of National Action Plans, or NAPs, on business and human rights by various states, including Thai, Japanese, and Pakistani governments, to fulfill their Pillar 1 states' obligations. Despite the enactments of the NAPs, rights violations continue to rise against community members, indigenous peoples, and workers in countries where businesses operate, including those countries that have enacted NAPs. For this reason, there is now a growing skepticism with the NAPs, with its implementation and development. Groups are now looking to instead focus efforts in advocating for mandatory human rights due diligence legislation. For this session, we will be learning about the different experiences in NAP development from civil society representatives and discuss possibilities and challenges with mandatory human rights due diligence legislation. It is a great privilege for us to be joined by an amazing panel, starting with Emilie Palamy Pradichit, who is the founder and executive director of Manushya Foundation. She is an intersectional feminist visionary and international human rights lawyer, specializing in accessing justice for marginalized communities. Emilie was the architect of Thailand's independent CSO National Baseline Assessment on Business and Human Rights, and was central to the establishment of the Thai-BHR network. Experiencing the failure of the Thailand's NAP-BHR in ensuring businesses' respect for human rights, Manushya is coordinating a national movement advocating for mandatory human rights due diligence legislation and a standalone anti-SLAPP law. We also have Yvette Gonzalez, who is the Strategic Engagement and Advocacy Director at PODER, and a business and human rights specialist. She coordinates the civil society focal group on business and human rights in Mexico, influences public policies, develops capacities of various actors, and actively collaborates with various national and international networks on the subject. She is currently working to achieve the structural changes needed to achieve responsible investment related to people's and communities' human rights in the context of business activities. She holds a master's degree in responsible management and sustainable economic development from the UN-mandated University for Peace. We also have Misa Norigami, who is my colleague from the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Misa joined the Resource Center in May 2021. She is responsible for research and outreach in Japan, including the Japanese monthly newsletters published by the Resource Center. Misa holds an LLM in Public International Law and an LLB from Waseda University, as well as an advanced LLM in European and International Human Rights Law from Leiden University. And lastly, we have Sarah Brooks. Sarah provides strategic guidance as an ISHR program director and leads ISHR's work in Europe and with respect to defenders of migrant and refugee rights. She also supports ISHR's work on corporate accountability. Prior to joining ISHR, Sarah worked to advance U.S. foreign policy in the area of labor rights and supply chains. She has master's degrees in public policy and Chinese studies from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Thank you, dear panelists, for agreeing to join our discussion today. And now we go to the discussion proper. Starting with Emilie. Emilie, during the Responsible Business and Human Rights Forum in Bangkok in September, your organization, Manushya Foundation, with the Thai BHR network, staged a protest, which essentially called on governments to stop napping. Manushya Foundation played a pivotal role in the development of the first Thai nap. So, can you share with us the role of Manushya Foundation in the development of the Thai nap and the main issues you have with the nap?
Thank you, Poshoy. It's a pleasure to co-organize this event with all of you and to bring this very important discussion on the NAP and the implementation of the UNGPs through the NAP. So yes, during the Responsible Business and Human Rights Forum in Bangkok in September, we did stage a peaceful protest. It was peaceful. We just had banners, especially during the session where the Thai government was talking about bringing change through how the UNGPs can bring change through NAPs. So it was important for us to respond to that because we worked on Thailand National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights since 2017. And we have been very disappointed by the content of the NAP and the way that we have been used in the process. And I think what we have witnessed in Thailand is something that we want to share with people because we don't want people to duplicate what we have been experiencing, especially that now voluntary measures are highly being promoted in our region in Asia, through NAPs in Southeast Asia and through voluntary HRDDs in East Asia. So that's a huge concern that we have. Our story of the NAP is very simple. Like in 2016, Thailand went through its second UPR cycle. We lobbied to have a NAP recommendation at the UPR. We got it. We were in love with the UNGPs and the ideas of having National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights to hold corporates into account, to make sure that there would be responsible business conduct on the ground, that, you know, a NAP would guide the strategy for businesses to respect human rights, but also for communities to be able to access remedy. And we're also hoping that the NAP would include mandatory human rights due diligence as part of it, because the NAP should be a good mix of, you know, mandatory and voluntary measures. So we got very excited and we decided to influence the content of the NAP. And so in order to do that, we decided to develop a national baseline assessment. But at that time, Manushya had no capacity really to work on the NAP. We had the communities that are being, we are working closely with the communities that are being impacted by business activities at the workplace and outside. So we were already working with farmers, peasants, indigenous people, sex workers, informal workers, the LGBTI community. So we decided to do this national baseline assessment and to call upon a regional expert. So that's when we started working with Praveen, who is here. At that time, he was with AIPP, with Debbie from Alexandria, to come and train us, to train all the communities that we work with, to learn about the UNGPs, to be able to engage with the government. We also decided to invite the Thai government to engage with us and to hear directly from affected communities when we're doing our NBA dialogues in different regions of Thailand. So we invite the government, we invite businesses to come. Obviously, business don't come. We always have one representative of the UN Global Compact who talks for the whole business sector in Thailand. And so we were engaging and communities were making meaningful recommendations to the government for the NAP while informing our NBA. The process took some time, but what we experienced was that there was a false narrative that was being given at the UN forum here since 2017 that the Thai government was being championed as the first Asian country to come up with an app. And so because we didn't have the funds to come here, we didn't know what was happening here. All we knew was that we were doing all the work on the ground to have meaningful engagement, to provide contribution to the government. And the first draft that we saw of the map was empty. So they used the priority areas that we found on the ground that as the most challenging issues that should be in the NAP regarding labor rights, impact on the environment, community rights, indigenous people and land, the protection of human rights defenders, and extraterritorial obligations. So the Thai government came up with this plan using our priority areas, claiming around the world that they had this meaningful engagement, and that they were coming up with the first NAP in Asia. So they were promoted through UNDP Business and Human Rights team that is receiving a lot of money to support Asian countries to develop NAPs. The issue that we have with it, and I think that was also happening in Latin America, is that when you have UN agencies taking over the development of NAP processes, they are pushing governments to be present at the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights. They are pushing governments to make commitments without looking at the content of it. So when you have UN Working Group members coming to Thailand and visiting Thailand to promote Thailand as the first Asian country to have a NAP, using, again, our data and claiming it as, taking all of our data and putting it in the UN Working Group report. I mean, members have changed, so I can say it now. And putting it in the UN Working Group report in 2019, I think we were pretty upset because we felt that we are building this strategy. We are building a network, the Thai BHR network. We are developing a national baseline assessment that is independent. We are giving all those comments to have a meaningful map. And in the end of the day, our pictures, our voices are being used by the government to claim that they had a meaningful engagement, but the policy document was totally weak. At the end of the day, we got a NAP that was very, very weak. It was not a good mix of voluntary and mandatory measures. There was only voluntary measures. If you look at Thailand's NAP, it's a work plan for meetings. Like, it's not actually a NAP. So it's basically asking the government to have meetings to discuss this policy and this policy. There's clearly no call for mandatory human rights due diligence. There's claims that there are effective anti-SLAPP measures already in the criminal procedure code, but we have increasing SLAPP casing coming up in Thailand. Since the military coup, there have been more than 450 women human rights defenders slapped in Thailand. So in the end, we're like, okay, we spend and all the funds for meaningful engagement were our funds. So we spend so much fund as civil society engaging in the NAP process to, in the end, what was used by the government to claim a meaningful process and be seen here at the international as this champion in Asia, to end up with a very NAP content. So I think it's really important for us to not only tell governments that it's really time to stop napping, because NAP do not bring changes on the ground. They are not a meaningful way to implement the UNGPs. And for us, the only meaningful way to implement the UNGPs is really through mandatory human rights due diligence. And we've been asking for it since the beginning of the development of the NAP. We were hoping that the NAP would call for it as well. It does not. Thailand is now will be launching its second NAP from 2023 to 2027. It's very similar to the first NAP. It does not take into account new issues that came up because civil society didn't want to engage with the government, so the government doesn't know what are the key issues that should be in the second NAP. It does not take into account digital rights. It does not take into account informal labor, in particular gig workers. It does not take into account unpaid care work that became increasingly important since COVID-19. Because the government didn't have meaningful participation for the development of the second NAP, you have a very weak second NAP coming up as well. So we are very worried that the government is still being praised as a champion in Asia, that now the government is following Japan, now that they saw our reaction towards the NAP, that we don't want NAP anymore, that we are asking civil society in the region to join us in our call to stop napping. They are moving forward to promoting themselves as ready to implement voluntary HRDD, producing HRDD guidelines for businesses, that businesses don't know anything about it, although they claim that they have disseminating it widely. And the worry that we have, especially coming to the forum, I think it was a shock for me. It's my first forum, right? So the shock that I had is to hear governments very proud of themselves to say that it took them 7 years to come up with a NAP. I'm taking the example of Kenya because I went to that session. It took them 6-7 years to come up with a NAP. And now that they have a NAP, the first phase of the NAP is to raise awareness with businesses on the UNGPs. So you consulted people for 7 years. Don't tell me you don't have time to talk about the UNGPs for 7 years. And now you want to sell us the NAP as the first phase for capacity building and awareness raising, because that's how government can get funding as well. That's how they can get support from UN agencies. And maybe in 10 years, we will be able to talk about voluntary HRDDs. So, it's like how many years do we have to wait until we will really be able to see corporate accountability on the ground. And I think that's why for us it's really important that countries stop napping and that countries start enacting mandatory human rights due diligence and for them to engage in the binding treaty. That's the only solution for us to make sure that we bring real corporate accountability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emilie, for sharing that input and talking about the NAP experience in Thailand. And yes, unfortunately, it seems like governments are very slow in developing meaningful policies and sort of resorting to all these voluntary mechanisms. And I think a key reflection with your input is really, valuing inclusiveness, meaningful participation from civil society. And, that's a very tricky, venture for governments to maintain that relationship with civil society. But it's an essential feature of the development of the NAP. And so thank you, Emilie. Moving on to what happened and what is happening in Mexico, Yvette. It's very interesting, the NAP process in Mexico. I think it was initially there was an initiative from government to develop the first Mexican NAP in 2015, but it fell short after civil society formally disengaged from the process in 2017. But now in 2022, there is it's the attempts to revive the development of the NAP is happening. So can you please share with us why civil society first disengaged in 2017 with the NAP process? And what is now the general sentiment of civil society on the NAP process in 2022? So have there been any improvements to the process, or is it more of the same?
Thank you to all the panelists, to everybody that is here. Well, we have very similar situation in Mexico as in Thailand. We did a lot of work from civil society organizations, organized to provide inputs in so many different ways for the government to actually come up with a national action plan. In that moment, in 2015, the context was appropriate to have an app. But I'm going to go deeper into this, but first I will answer your question, both of your questions. And one is related to why did we, as a formal civil society group, decided to disengage from that process. And it was because it didn't comply with the most basic international standards. They didn't adequately address key issues that we mentioned several times. And those key issues were, and I'm going to number them, it was one, improving access to justice and remedy for communities affected by business activity. The whole Pillar 3 was not there in the draft of the NAP. And only with that point, we can just disengage, no? But there were others. So in that part, we also asked for implementation of a law, of an apparel law reform, that is a form in Mexico, through which companies can be signed out as responsible authorities when they commit human rights abuses. Number two, we asked to highlight and recognize due diligence of companies, but the text didn't incorporate the need to publish environmental and social impact assessments at the time, and by law are not public. So, nor to consider due diligence processes throughout the value chain, including real beneficiaries or beneficial ownership, and it didn't establish actions to ensure transparency in the private sector, and it didn't even recognize, express, or it didn't explain in the text that the companies have obligation to respect human rights. A third point is the inclusion of solid protection mechanisms for human rights defenders and journalists, and the recognition of the figure of whistleblowers, which is a big deal in Mexico and all around the world. And another point is another point that was lacking in the text was a lack of recognition of free, prior, and informed consent processes as a right, and its outcome as binding. So the draft of the program restricted its application to indigenous peoples and communities and excluding peasants and similar communities with similar problems. And of course, that wasn't even linked with due diligence responsibility as stated in the UNGPs. And number 5, it's there was no explicit recognition of the state's responsibility to respect human rights when they act as an economic actor. So there were no strong guidelines for companies with state participation or control, nor in public procurement processes to respect human rights or to provide remedy in that case. And in your second question about the general sentiment of the new NAP process, I would say that in general, in a way, there is not a general opinion because this process is one that only a very few people knows about. So the few organizations in our national CSO platform have a lot of questions that have been unsolved for months, and compromises are not being kept. And we are not representatives of the wide, diverse, and broad civil society that should know about the process from the leading ministry. I do recognize that the government has had plenty of challenges, and some government officials involved have good intentions and ideas and have worked very hard, but we don't seem to get these messages through. The process needs to be an inclusive one. The process. In July this year, out of the blue, we received an invitation from UNGP, representing the Japanese government, to attend an event that presented one project with 2 objectives. One, to guide Japanese companies in Mexico to implement mandatory human rights due diligence, and the second one, to provide financial and technical support to develop an app. This involves several issues. One, that the standards of the NAP will also be done by these financiers. And there's a risk that we get into the voluntary human rights due diligence that is happening in Japan and that our colleague Lisa will talk about later. So the resources that this UNDP project will cover are for the NBA, for the National Baseline Assessment, and capacity building for public officials, which is fine. No? But that doesn't mean we know details about this. What is the content of these capacity building workshops or lessons for public officials, and how are they looking at remedy from the rights holders? No? So this baseline assessment was just published a few days ago, and there's not even 1 month to spread it, read it, give comments. So that's a huge challenge for rights holders. It's a very short time. The government will publish an app in July 2023. So possibly there will be 6 months to comment on a draft. And we don't know if there will be consultations, when or where or how. There is no public calendar or timeline or plans for the process and the activity. So this is very similar to what happened in 2015. And well, I can talk about the details of every single thing that I said, just when the time is right.
Thank you so much, Yvette. It seems that governments never learn. This is already the second chance to have a NAP, and it seems like, in terms of inclusiveness, it's getting worse. It's very top-down. It seems like I have yet to really hear a good story about, NAPs and, the genuine development of NAP, which sees civil society as partners. So, as I mentioned in the introduction, with this growing skepticism surrounding the national action plans, it seems that groups are looking more towards mandatory human rights due diligence, and that seems to be the trend, even with governments. And we move over now to MISA. So MISA, Japan recently issued human rights due diligence guidelines applicable to supply chains of companies. And this is very material and relevant to Southeast Asia because impacts of Japanese businesses are significant in Southeast Asian countries where much of their supply chains are located. In September, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, together with other civil society organizations, wrote a letter to the Japanese government to raise concerns with the development of these human rights due diligence guidelines. Can you please relate to us the issues that were raised in this letter? And further, can you share the main concerns you have with these HRDD guidelines?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Troy. Thank you, all the panelists and the audience. So quickly update. So Japan has been mentioned by the formal panelists, but quickly updates what's going on in Japan. So the government developed NAP in 2020 for the 2020 and 2025 this time frame. And after the adoption of NAP in 2021, so last year, the government did a survey to more than 2,000 companies and see if companies are doing their due diligence in the supply chains and what needs from the companies. And it turns out that there are a lot of companies who want guidance by the government about how to implement the due diligence in the supply chain. So with this survey result, the government decided to develop guidelines this year, actually. So a study group was formed with some of experts, and that was launched in March, and the draft was shared in August, and the final version was adopted in September. So what's the problem throughout this process? As you can tell from the timeline, it was really rapid. It was really, really quick. Well, we were really surprised how, the speed of the Japanese government, because we were not really expecting this quick development at the government level. But then just within this few months, guidelines were adopted. So the problem is the whole process of the development of the guidelines was really, really not transparent. The details of the guidelines were not published until August. That's when the draft was published. And the public was given 1 month to give a public comment. And as a result, more than 700 comments came from more than 131 individuals, companies, groups. So it's a massive amount of comments. And we also submitted a public comment with the Work Benchmarking Alliance, our partner. But then, so the deadline of the public comment was the end of August. And they adopted in 13 September. So can you, it's impossible to, obviously, to reflect all these comments within 2 weeks. So obviously they did not reflect all these comments. So that was really problematic. And I personally found it problematic also because when the draft was published, it was only in Japanese in the beginning, and then the English version was published later, I think 1 week later. So I find it a little bit problematic because, so for Japanese government, a lot of the affected communities are in supply chains and they don't know Japanese. So in order to involve them in the process of developing these guidelines, they needed to engage in the right way, and that's what they failed to do. So that's what we raised in this joint letter to the government. And it was not only us, also other CSOs who were involved. We have this stakeholder like a group who were also involved in the NAP process, and they also raised the same issue. So I guess everybody else, other than the government itself, was really believed that this whole process was a bit too quick. Like I feel like they just want to adopt something, and that's it. Mm-hmm. So that was really, really problematic. And in terms of content, I can highlight some of the concerns. First, I think the guidelines only focus on the human rights perspective, and they failed to address the climate justice and environmental harms in these guidelines, which is a shame because there are a lot of Japanese companies project like funding this kind of problematic project, environment project outside of the country. So that's one thing, and also. It's guidelines, but there are just so little guidance on the remedy part or like the grievance mechanism that companies can establish. The section was the last part of the guidelines, and it was so short, and I was so disappointed. So they could have given because they wanted to give guidance to companies, so they should really. Have given more guidance to the companies. What the government actually was saying that they're going to adopt like a practical guidance to implement these guidelines. So we are still waiting for that. So let's hope if they can give more guidance in that perspective. Yeah, I think I will end up there for now.
Thank you, Lisa, for that intervention. Yes. I guess it's sort of similar to the development of the NAPs in Thailand and Mexico with Japan. I mean, for the government to develop these guidelines in 6 months or even shorter with very few attempts to consult civil society, again, very top-down approach. Doesn't take into account the key factors that need to be done in order to have a meaningful policy document, which is transparency and inclusiveness, and I think with consultations as well, especially for countries like Japan, whose companies operate outside of their country, I think it's also relevant to consult communities that are affected outside Japan, or such countries. So I think we can now move on to what's happening elsewhere in countries in Europe, for example. And this will be touched on by the panelists later. But there's also calls, of course, to progress from voluntary guidelines, NAPs, voluntary human rights due diligence, to mandatory mechanisms. And this is the call of most groups. And well, other countries have been developing mandatory human rights due diligence and other legislation that have extraterritorial impacts. And Sarah, can you briefly share with us the key features of the EU Mandatory Human Rights and Environmental Due Diligence Directive, particularly on the access to remedy? And when passed, under the law, will victims of corporate abuse outside of the EU, will they be able to access EU courts to sue TNCs for damages? And lastly, how do we ensure that these laws that have extraterritorial impacts are effective and accessible to impacted rights holders or communities? I know that's a lot.
There's a lot there, and it may take us a couple of rounds of questions to unpack everything. But I think I want to start by recognizing that this is a really timely question. For those of you who know, the EU Council adopted the legislative project only Monday night, so like less than 48 hours ago. And I think, while there's a lot of hope in that, there's a lot of additional analysis to do. And the downside of the timeliness is that I haven't had time to go through all of the text of the current proposal. So what I think is maybe better to do at this stage is really to reflect on what were the messages coming from civil society, from trade unions, and in some cases from the private sector. And what was the expectation, right? That this legislative project would raise the bar for corporate responsibility, both in the EU and for companies based outside the EU, but doing business there, and provide a response to the concerns of victims and communities. So first, one of the main things that our organization networks across Europe and indeed globally looked at was the scope of companies that would be covered by the due diligence legislation. I think many of us in this room, and hopefully all of us in this room, are clear that it's no longer acceptable to create a blanket exception for SMEs, right? There are things that one can adjust and adapt, but a blanket exception really fails, I think, to make the point about the importance of due diligence being throughout supply chains. We also focused on language around high-impact sectors, and that the criteria for identifying high-impact sectors needed to be clear and transparently applied, and specifically, and this is something we very much agree with the Business and Human Rights Resource Center on, that it does need to apply to tech. My understanding is that in the draft that has come out from the Council, that is included, as well as the financial sector, which was the final element of coverage that we felt was really essential. Anybody who's providing capital also, under international standards, does have a link to any of the negative human rights impacts which may flow from those investments. Second, the scope of rights, so needing to consider all relevant international human rights instruments and labor standards, as well as international norms. So, for example, respecting the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. We talked about the analysis of due diligence and needing to really have it clear to companies that they have to take into mind issues of intersectionality. They have to be approaching it with a gender-responsive lens, and that they have to include also climate and the environment, which in various versions had been in and out of the legislation over the years of its development. On value chains, the obligations apply upstream and downstream. And this was one of the key points for negotiation among the states. But the EU cannot adopt a legislative package that takes us backwards from where international human rights law and jurisprudence is. Due diligence, also, it's useful to add, must be risk-based and proportionate, right? So we can't simply pick and choose where and how companies should be engaging in due diligence. And finally, in terms of process and access to remedy, and the need for meaningful consultation and stakeholder engagement with civil society, trade unions, and communities, both to map their value chains, disclose their findings, and work together to most effectively identify the risks of negative human rights impacts. Incidentally, the importance of this practice has also been recognized by business, right? This isn't the sort of things that we are putting on the table weren't only civil society. And I think it's really critical to remember that. Finally, for access to justice and remedy, the robust enforcement of mechanisms allowing for civil and administrative liability is necessary. And there's been a lot of back and forth on how that will be implemented in practice, including penalties for harms. But I think that what is the additional concern is that this isn't sufficient to address the practical barriers that victims of corporate human rights abuse face. So that includes issues of burden of proof, access to evidence, the offloading of responsibility to third-party auditors, and frankly, lengthy judicial procedures, even in developed rule of law countries. So to the fullest extent possible, the Commission needs to put in place rules and policies to address it and ensure that member states follow them. And I'll just conclude by saying, sort of in the trajectory that we've outlined here, that there was an important role for national level action in creating the political climate that allowed this to develop. Right? Many EU countries were very early adopters of the NAP concept, very early champions of the UN Guiding Principles. But even as early as I would say pre-2015, seeing the gaps in what that was actually able to do led then to national initiatives. So due diligence laws in Germany and France, some sector-specific or issue-specific legislation, I'm thinking particularly of the UK, Netherlands, and the US. So it's sort of helpful to think about how that created an environment in which it was possible to see some of the gaps, right? That it was possible to see also why the imperative of mandatory human rights due diligence was so important.
Thank you, Sarah, for that intervention. And yeah, I think that's a really good segue to the next question for the panel. You mentioning that the push for the NAPs early on sort of created this environment, right? And which led to now having this push for mandatory human rights due diligence. So I want to ask the panel. The NAP is a Pillar 1 obligation, of course, under the UNGPs, under the state obligation to protect human rights. So after 11 years of the UNGPs, do you still see any value in pursuing a NAP? Maybe we can start with Misa.
So the Japanese guidelines were adopted to implement NAPs. That's the policy strategy by the government. So, and although I shared concerns with you about the guidelines, I still think these voluntary guidelines are important to make impact to mobilize Japanese companies in terms of their willingness to commitment. Because so at the Resource Center, I release monthly newsletters every month. And I feel like every time when I put any article or any input about the government policy development, it's often the most viewed or the articles that get most interest by business people and others as well. So I think the companies need leadership or initiative by the government to facilitate the process. So in that sense, I see the value of the NAP and also this voluntary guidelines. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that we don't, it still means that we should pursue for the mandatory measures. Especially because I remember when I was talking about the guidelines with our partner in Cambodia, and I was asking them, what are the impacts for, can these guidelines make in terms of the supply chains and workers? And they shared, actually they provided like a blog post for our website about this insight, so you were more than welcome to view it on our website. But yeah, they shared with us that in the end, it's not mandatory. So still pursuing or calling for compensation against government, it's just not possible. So so it's like I still see the value, but I still think we definitely should go forward to discuss more about the mandatory measures in Japan. Yeah.
Thank you, Misa. So you were saying that these new guidelines on human rights due diligence are actually come from the Japanese NAP. It's a product or within the umbrella of the NAP. Mm-hmm. And you see, even though these policy instruments are voluntary and are just guidelines, I guess in the Japan context, it is still an important step, but you're also saying that we cannot stay there. And we need still to push for mandatory mechanisms. Yvette, we go to you. What is the value of the NAP for you after 11 years?
Okay. Thank you. I think that if it is process that responds to our current reality with inclusivity and used to balance powers, it might be still useful. But because the same process as we had in 2015 that I already explained, it's already outdated. Regulations are urgently needed, and I think efforts should be primarily there. If the NAP is an effort of capacity building for public officials and companies, it might be another initiative. We should not call it a NAP. We don't need that. If that doesn't serve for access to remedy, that is the topic of today's discussion. Thailand civil society didn't want to repeat the Mexican scenario where we couldn't endorse the process. And now we are likely to face a current Thai scenario in Mexico. So it's coming back. Everything is coming back. We are having the same conversations all over the world. So if the NAP is, it should be, like linked to existing standards, commitments, national, international regulations, such as the International Protocol for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ESCASUR Regional Agreement on access to information, public participation, access to justice in environmental matters in Latin America and the Caribbean. And the NAP leads to other processes such as law reforms, implementation of those laws, regulations on civil and criminal liability for corporate involvement in human rights abuses, and mandatory human rights due diligence. Well, maybe, no? But it should also lead to the course that is going on developing an international binding treaty on BHR that is being currently negotiated. Yeah.
Thank you, Yvette. Those requirements that you mentioned, those are big ifs, those are big asks, and it looks like just judging from the Mexican scenario and the experience in 2015, and it seems like it's happening again in 2022. The real realization of how the NAP should be developed and even the content seems like a pipe dream. So very, very much understand your sentiments. I think we can move on to Emilie. I think we know what you're going to say.
Yeah, no, we don't believe in NAPs. The Mexican scenario, like we were warned, actually Fernanda warned me about the Mexican scenario back in 2018 in the Philippines during ESCRNet General Assembly. We had a meeting to talk about corporate capture, and he shared with me the experience of the Mexican scenario. At that time, I was still hoping that, we would have a good NAP. Why? Because what you mentioned, the importance of inclusiveness and the process that we had to us was good. We have everybody involved. We have a broad network. We have sex workers, indigenous people, farmers, peasants. Everybody is involved. So we thought we would have a good NAP, And we ended up having a NAP that does not even recognize indigenous people, does not recognize sex workers. The government at the latest UPR review of Thailand just last year was still saying that indigenous people do not exist in Thailand. So if you're an indigenous person or a sex worker who has engaged in a NAP process since 2017, you went to all the meetings with the government, you shared how your dad has been killed. You're coming saying, in 2 weeks I'm going to jail because I'm being criminalized under Thailand's false climate solution, so that my land can be given to a company for carbon credit. So when you are a person that still tries to engage with the government through the NAP, thinking that the NAP might be a solution for affected communities to seek remedy, that the NAP would have these obligations, And then you see that in the end of the day, you are excluded from the NAP. You still go to jail. The government is totally overlooking you. Do you still believe in NAPs and you still want NAPs 11 years later? No. You clearly don't want to engage again. And you clearly don't want NAPs again. Because in Thailand, the NAP is a greenwashing product of UNGP, of the Thai government, coming here at the UN-BHR forum, using whitewashing to claim themselves as champions. What we are seeing happening in Japan, it's also happening now in Thailand. So there was capacity, there was opportunities for capacity building during the NAP process. We took that advantage. As civil society, we got ourselves with all the knowledge that we needed to understand the UNGPs, to understand how to engage. The government failed to do that. I don't believe that NAPs should be reframed as capacity building opportunities for businesses. No. In Europe or in France, the government did not wait for companies to be ready for mandatory human rights due diligence to pass the legislation. It was not actually coming from the NAP process in France. It was coming from a parliamentarian, from an MP. It was a parliamentarian initiative because they were sick and tired of companies, They were sick and tired of profit over people. So they pushed for the mandatory human rights due diligence through the parliament. And that's something that we want to do as well in Thailand. Like, we are not hoping that the NAP is going to open doors for voluntary HRDDs and one day to mandatory HRDDs. I believe that now we need to work with people who actually can enact this type of legislation. We need to work with parliamentarians like people did in France, because we cannot wait for the government to comply with the Pillar 1 duty. This is not going to happen. And what we see, what is happening here at the BHR Forum, with Japan sponsoring a lot of people coming here, sponsoring CSOs and, others to come here, a huge presence of UNDP to promote the Japanese government. We are experiencing what we experienced when they were promoting Thailand with the NAPs. Now they're promoting Japan with a voluntary HRDD. For me, I see it as a huge risk. Greenwashing, whitewashing. That's not what we want. We want mandatory human rights due diligence. We want people to be able to seek remedy now, and that's the only way forward for us to be able to really have access to remedy and compensation for communities is through mandatory human rights due diligence and the binding treaty. The NAPs for us are over. That's why we keep saying stop napping. Like, you can have good NAPs. We see people telling us, you don't understand a NAP. So, and sometimes I feel it's insulting, because when we got ourselves capacitated to understand UNGPs and the NAP, when experts are telling us, you don't understand what is a NAP, the NAP is not meant to bring remedy. No, the NAP is meant to guide and provide, clear guidance on the next step for the government, and they're not following it. So, no, we don't believe in NAPs at all. We want mandatory human rights due diligence, we want a binding treaty, and we want corporations to be held into account. We want clear corporate accountability. That's what we want.
Thanks, Emilie. I think that's very clear from your explanation. I think you already sort of answered this, Sarah, but after hearing the frustrations from the other panelists, I guess and you mentioned that, there's still value with these soft law, like the NAPs, to sort of create this environment to bring about things like mandatory human rights due diligence. But I guess the question is, like, how long should we give governments this time to evolve to mandatory mechanisms?
So just to be more precise, I think the NAP was an important condition, not because it's clearly leading, but because it highlighted what the fault lines were. It highlighted where the gaps were. And then I think this is where civil society and parliamentarians were able to step in to point out that this wasn't working the way it was. So I mentioned the global north broadly as an early uptake or early adapter to NAPs. As of 2020, according to the Danish Institute, there were 17 EU member states who had national action plans. Add to that Ukraine, Switzerland, US, and the UK. So you've got quite a range there. I think you would be very hard pressed to find any of those that was ambitious, focused on concrete change, did more than simply summarize, largely speaking, what government positions were and what existing processes were in place. And very few, to my knowledge at least, where they were going out and actually asking affected communities what they were interested in. And I think especially for governments of the global north, where we have so many multinationals headquartered, that's a real failure, I think, a real example of negligence. But we were, I think, maybe somewhat similar to, Yvette's comments early on. We thought that if the process was good, there was a possibility, right? And so in 2016, ISHR and International Corporate Accountability Roundtable published a guidance on human rights defenders and national action plans, looking at both the procedural and the substantive elements that we wanted to see in order to ensure that defenders' voices and perspectives were respected. Fast forward to last year, and I think a deep frustration and also a growing interest in saying, what can alternative tools, what can, for example, the binding treaty actually provide that so far our experience with NAPs has not. Fast forward to last year, the Working Group on Business and Human Rights in its roadmap for the next 10 years identified national action plans as a potential tool for policy coherence and as possible for creating platforms for awareness raising and capacity building. And I think we were really disappointed by this because it seemed to indicate a failure to really understand what the challenges to NAPs in practice had been, the challenges from communities. But there was one final point. So they add this sort of an equal standing to the others. I think for us, it's what is critical is that NAPs are useful, and I quote, as stepping stones for mandatory human rights due diligence legislation. Now, maybe in an ideal setting, that's actually building towards. Maybe if it's actually reflecting the realities that we've seen, it's about saying this, where is this not working, and what are the alternatives that actually might help to ensure that victims can see some remedy, that corporate actors are respecting human rights. So the NAP as a process and a tool, it can't be in and of itself. And I think one thing that I would really echo, especially reflecting on what our colleagues have shared from Mexico and the Thai context, but also, the broader Asian region specifically, that I don't think funding for national action plans should be used, intentionally or otherwise, to allow states to engage in box-ticking exercises or to distract from the clear calls that domestic civil society is actually putting out, those who are best placed to actually say what does need to happen concretely.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, I think that's something that the working group should be thinking about because we all know that there's a lot of funding also being poured into development of the NAPs, and maybe it's time to also review the strategy of looking at other frameworks that can be more effective to realize rights of people that are affected by business operations. I realized that I know we have a hard stop at 8. I have another question, but I think we'll have to skip that because we only have 15 minutes. Maybe we can have we can open the floor now to questions. Yes, sir.
So I work on development banks, and development banks have been requiring human rights due diligence from their clients, or due diligence, which includes human rights to some extent. And I've seen how that's failing when it's required. So I'm just wondering, what is it that the NAPs I'm not really interested in, sorry, but the human rights due diligence, what guarantees are we getting that just because human rights due diligence is required, that it's going to be done properly with the new legislation? And I didn't catch it, Sarah, if you mentioned or not about what you mentioned about financial sector, but I don't know if you know the development right now. France, Italy, and Spain have removed financial sector from. This is happening today, and there's a big. So just a bit of an update that right now they're trying to get the financial sector out of it, so it's not going to be
And this despite
covered.
being able to hear from, almost 100 responsible investors who are saying, wait, it should be included, right? Again, it's not, they're not just ignoring civil society in this.
Yeah, but it's just, I wanted to hear what, because I've seen that even when it's required, due diligence, it's failing miserably. And I think the reason why is it's not so surprising. The companies are going in because they want to get the project through. So even carrying out due diligence, they find ways to get around issues that would prevent their projects from going ahead, their investments from going ahead. So I'm just wondering what is it in this mandatory human rights due diligence that we're talking about that will help us not run into those situations?
Maybe you can.
No, that please, because I think in general terms, and then maybe I can look at a bit the EU specifically.
You can go explain about the EU.
So no, I think you're absolutely right. And if I reflect on sort of ISHR's other experience in trying to move from voluntary to legislated ideas of protecting human rights, so specifically around legal protection for human rights defenders, we see exactly the same thing. We see states who are adopting laws and implementing regulations, and the content of those falls far short of what international standards are. We see states who are adopting laws and regulations, but failing entirely, for example, to actually repeal or revise existing law that actually runs counter to it. We see states failing to actually back up those laws with, this is where I'm getting to your point, robust monitoring and enforcement mechanisms at the national level and the regional level to ensure that the protections that these laws are meant to guarantee, or the obligations that these laws are meant to pose, are in fact being respected. And I think this is, to me, as a non-expert on this particular topic, but this is to me where the discussions around the balance of administrative and civil penalty in the EU context has been so important. Because not only is that about what access do victims and communities have, but it's also about what is the broader context in which incentives or disincentives actually exist and might potentially shift behavior, but all too often being a drop in the bucket and entirely ignorable for a large multinational.
This is Praveen. I am from Nepal. I'll share some experience from Nepal, and then I have a question for Misa, I guess. So apparently Nepal is also developing a national action plan. I found out about that from the website of the global NAP-BHR, the website that DIHR manages. And it's the UNGP that's supporting the government of Nepal too. We have the indigenous delegates who have been attending the Business and Human Rights Forum at the regional level, at the global level. We have been, trying to get to the UNDP to get a copy of the NAP as per the information on the global NAPs.org. The NAP was already supposed to be disclosed by end of last year and adopted by the beginning of this year. We still haven't seen a copy of it yet. I have written to the UNDP in Nepal too. They still haven't sent it to me yet. And those who attended the consultation, the one-time consultation that UNDP organized, said that the representatives were handpicked. The indigenous representatives have called on for a dedicated consultation with indigenous peoples because, of course, indigenous communities in Nepal are one of the key stakeholders and most vulnerable, facing risks in the context of business operations. No. So in that context, and in the context of countries such as Nepal, and I think Nepal is a good example of other countries in South Asia and in the so-called global South. I mean, again, if NAP is going to be just a study without any, dedicated or like concrete actions towards legal reforms, as was aspired in Mexico or in Thailand, I think it's better to it's almost good to nothing. Again, I understand the phrase that we have something is better than nothing, but what is something that is almost good as nothing? So I think that we have already brought it to the attention of the UN Working Group too, and then the UN Working Group member has said that they will bring it to the attention of the UNDP. I'm also saying this because again, Nepal is a prime example. We ratified ILO Convention 169 in 2007. It's been 15 years. Nepal doesn't still have any law that recognizes or protects indigenous people's rights. The National Action Plan on ILO Convention 169 has been stuck in the cabinet for the last 10 years. India, they adopted a draft. They published a draft NAP in 2019. They still haven't adopted it. So I don't think we can consider that NAP will lead to something like it did in Europe. So having said that, I think my 2 cents here would be like, do we really believe that NAP will lead to something in the global south is my question. And that leads to my question to Misa, like. I am guessing you work in Japan, no? So do you really believe that Asian country like Japan, that is very friendly to businesses, will lead to something? The mandate. I read the voluntary guidelines too. Will that lead to something like a mandatory human rights due diligence law that countries in Europe have? So that's first part of the question, and then the second part of the question is, do Japanese civil society or like parliamentarians, legislative bodies have a push towards such mandatory measures?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, can these voluntary measures lead to mandatory measures? To be honest, it's very difficult to anticipate. But I can really tell that government, I think they really think that it's a bit too early for mandatory measures, because the problem of businesses in Japan and perhaps in other countries as well, as the basic concept of human rights, it's still not understood deeply and well. So it's really and as you said, the country itself is really friendly to business sector. So when there's this big push or big constraint from that side, I would say it's a bit difficult to expect that the mandatory measures will be adopted anytime soon. But because this push from the EU countries and also US is implementing regulations in like trade, build. So what Japan thinks is important is definitely level playing field for Japanese companies. So in that context, I do think there is a hope for the mandatory measures, but we still need to assess those, and perhaps that's your next question. I think CSOs and parliamentary members, like those actors, still need to push for it. And for CSOs, the partners that I work with, yes, they do believe the mandatory measures are really important. We did have several events actually calling for the mandatory measures, and I know there are also some parliamentary members who are really interested in developing mandatory HREDD. So we have people. But I would say also the problem is we really need to involve the affected communities in this whole dialogue in Japan. Like, this is an island, and the language, it's really a big barrier to involve the affected communities. But for Japan, the supply chains are everywhere. So I really think this key message in this, or this theme in this UNGPs forum, put the rights holder at center. That's really need to be implemented in the process, in the designing of the process, from the very beginning. So that's my answer to your question. Yeah.
Thank you, Misa. I think so we have 5 minutes. I think we can end the Q&A with these questions online, and it's mostly on Thailand, Emilie, so you'll have to take this. And I'll just read both questions. What is hindering the Thai government from doing meaningful participation. What do you think UNDP could have done differently for the NAP process in Thailand? How could UNDP have verified who undertook the stakeholder engagement?
What was the first question?
What is hindering the Thai government from doing meaningful participation? And if you can limit it to 2 minutes, because we still have the
So the Thai government did not do meaningful engagement. We did it. Like we came up with our own strategy to build a national baseline assessment, and we invited the government to join us so they could hear directly from affected communities. So the government is not invest in meaningful engagement. We created it for them. The second question regarding UNDP's role and how UNDP could have cross-checked. It's very concerning to hear how many times UNDP has been referred during this session, and the fact that the person online is asking the question, how can UNDP cross-check? It seems like, is the NAP a UNDP project? I thought the NAP was coming from the UN working group, and the mandate of the working group is to make sure the UNGPs are being implemented through NAPs. But what we're experiencing here is like, it seems like NAPs became a UNDP project. So UNDP is not here to cross-check who should be engaged in a NAP process. UNDP should not be here to develop a national baseline assessment. The role of UNDP is to build the capacity of governments, and it's an intergovernmental organization that is meant to support governments. So if they're meant to support governments to do their job well, they should tell the government to reach out to ORCHR, to the UN working group to get the right guidance and to do it well and right. It should not be led by UNDP. So the question regarding how UNDP can cross-check, I want to reply, UNDP is not the role of UNDP to cross-check. Sadly, UNDP is receiving all the funding, and we hope that it would change. The funding should go to ORCHR Secretariat to support the UN working group to make sure that there's real meaningful engagement on the ground. And we hope that by now the UN working group will be supporting us on the ground, pushing for mandatory human rights due diligence, because there's no time to wait. People are dying, people are being affected. We have no more time for awareness raising. Awareness raising will come when companies will be held into account. Now in France and in other European countries, companies have the capacity being built because they are scared of being, charged. They are scared of lawsuits. So as a result of that, they have to build the capacity. It's not the other way around. It's not waiting for them to be ready. It's, even if they're not ready, it has to come. Then they will have to be ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Emilie, and thank you to our dear panelists. It has been a great discussion on NAPs and mandatory human rights due diligence. Now we arrive at our closing, and we are very privileged to have the chairperson of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, and also the co-executive director of PUDER, Ms. Fernanda Hoppenheim.
Okay. Hello, good evening, everyone. Maybe morning or afternoon elsewhere. If you're online, thank you for this rich discussion. Apologies for being late. It was the closure of the forum, and it's always challenging to just leave the space. Everybody's stopping you and want to congratulate you or give you feedback. But I think I would like to share maybe 2 minutes or 3 of a few reflections. First of all, let me tell you that there is nothing in our mandate that obliges us or anybody else to develop NAPs. Our mandate is to promote the implementation of UN guiding principles as a global standard that clarifies the obligations of states that are already there, nothing new. States are obliged to protect and guarantee human rights for all. It just clarifies that with regards to business activities, but no new obligations. It does stress very clearly that companies have the obligation to respect, or the responsibility to respect, human rights, and provides guidance for due diligence. And of course, the access to remedy and justice component, and outlines different ways of accessing that remedy, judicial, non-judicial, and grievance mechanisms at the company level. So NAPs have been a way in which kind of historically the UNGPs have been taken up, but this doesn't mean it's the only way or it's the best way necessarily. Our job is to promote that human rights are protected in the context of business activities, to monitor that. And if you were to see us conducting country missions, Some of us have been witnesses to that, me before being a member in the visit to Mexico. You'd see how, the working group collects really, and I just conducted a mission to Liberia. We really engage with the community and right holders and provide very strong recommendations for countries, for governments, for different state actors. It's not just, have a work plan. For me, the challenge is that many NAPs have been historically work plans or a list of commitments. And that's not an action plan, or maybe we should call them differently, right? When I think about NAPs, I think about public policy. And I guess we could all agree that a good public policy can contribute to the effectiveness, to the effective enjoyment of any given human right? Like good housing policies or good education or health policies, etc. So if the NAPs were a way to create policy coherence and good public policy to address harms caused by companies, and I think it could be a good combination with good regulations and laws that protect human rights and demand mandatory obligations for companies, right? So I guess the problem I'm trying to share with you, or the challenge I see, is that NAPs, in my view, have been misinterpreted. The way they have been built in most of the 50 countries that have a NAP is as a work plan. So that's, of course, is a challenge. It doesn't solve anything. Even when, for example, Peru, I think, had a decent process, engaging with many, many stakeholders, and the actual they prioritized 24 issues, including indigenous peoples, LGBTI, women and girls, etc., etc. So the plan, it's okay, and the process was fine, but then implementation becomes another challenge. So first of all, if you just have a wish list, then that's a mistake. And then if you have a rather good plan, let's say, then implementation is the other challenge. So I think that's kind of the history we have, and I totally understand. And I'm very sympathetic, and I agree to some extent that it has been disheartening and disappointing. That doesn't mean in the future it could be better if it's combined with other elements. So what I would say is, I hate this expression, I have to be frank, of smart mixed. But let's use an intelligent combination or something different, right? But a combination of things, these are systematic problems. So you can't solve it with one law, you can't solve it either, right? Not one law, not one public policy, let alone a work plan, that's even worse. Or not one treaty, to be honest, right? So I think that it's the combination of all those measures that it's going to take us somewhere. Plus the hopefully better practices by the private sector, which is different from self-regulation, don't get me wrong, it's better practices. So that would be my hope, and that would be my call for action for states and companies to really think about this combination, not as a word we use lightly, but as a real commitment to protect human rights in the context of business activities. So I'll leave it there. And I hope we can continue to discuss, not tonight, I'm a bit tired, but in the coming months and maybe years. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Have a good night.